Good evening and welcome back. The hour has grown quiet and the world beyond your window has begun the slow folding of itself that all old worlds know. The lamps are low, the rooms have softened at their edges, and whatever the day asked of you can now begin, little by little, to loosen its hold. Let your shoulders settle, let your jaw rest, let your hands lie wherever they have come to rest, open or folded, whichever feels more natural to the body that has carried you this far. Tonight, we enter the story of Zeus, lord of the bright air, king of the gods of Olympus, father of weather and judgment, and the long human practice of swearing by something larger than oneself. His story is often told loudly in other places, full of thunder and contests and proud commands, but here it will arrive gently, the way distant thunder sounds when heard from a warm room with thick walls. There will be no urgency. There will be no excitement asking you to remain awake. The names will pass over you like soft music. The places will rise and fade like the patterns of dream. If sleep finds you in the first chapter, that is well. If it finds you only at the candle's last breath, that is also well. Get cozy, settle in, and let us begin. The story will hold its own shape while you drift, the way old stories have always held their own shape, kept faithfully across long centuries by tellers who knew that not every listener needed to hear the whole tale at once. We will begin before the throne, before Olympus, before the eagle, before the thunderbolt. We will begin in a time the Greeks called the rule of the Titans, when the world was younger and stranger, and the gods who governed it were older than the gods we are about to meet. The story turns on a hidden child, on a mother's quiet courage, on a cave in the limestone hills of Crete, on a small herb pressed into a golden cup, and on the slow gathering of a power that would one day shape the sky. Imagine then that we are stepping back through time, not by counting the years, of which there are too many, but by softening the edges of the world until the modern landscape gives way to the older one. The cities are gone, the roads are gone, the harbours are gone. What remains is a Mediterranean of darker water under a moon that has not yet learned the names that will be given to it. Islands lie scattered like sleeping animals, mountains lean against the sky, rivers move with the patience of things that have nowhere they are required to be by sunrise. This is the world before the gods we know. The earth has already brought forth her children, slow and immense the Titans. The sky has already lowered itself toward her, and from that union have come the great elder powers, Okeanos, the encircling river, Tethys, his sister wife, Hyperion, the lifting one, Thea, the shining, Krios, Koios, Phoebe, Themis the upright, Mnemosyne the rememberer, Iapetos the piercer, and last, the youngest of them, Cronus, the harvester, who would one day lift a curved blade against his own father and become the lord of a long age. You do not have to hold any of these names. They are mentioned only to mark the shape of the world we are entering. The Titans are not the focus of tonight. They are the dim weather of the story, the great elder air against which the younger gods will eventually rise. For now, let them be a sound of wind across an old ridge, a quality of the dark that you do not need to name to feel. In the beginning of this older world, there was no Olympus as we now imagine it. Olympus was only a mountain. The high gods had not yet built their halls upon its summit. The eagles that would one day be Zeus's eagles flew without belonging to anyone. The oaks that would one day be sacred had not yet been spoken to as oracles. The world was waiting. It did not know yet that it was waiting, the way deep water sometimes does not know it is waiting for the moon, but the wait was there, slow and patient, gathering its shape under the surface of things. Cronus, the youngest of the Titans, had become the lord of his generation. The old stories tell of how he came to that station, how Earth, weary of her great husband Sky's endless pressing against her, gave to her son a curved sickle of adamant, and how Cronus used that sickle once, decisively, against his father Sky. From that moment Sky drew back. The two great original powers were separated, and into the space between them the world, as the Greeks would later know it, began to open. But this is a sleep story, and we will not linger on the sharp metals of that earlier wound. We will only note that Cronus inherited the rule of the world by an act of severance, and that what is severed once tends, in old myth, to be feared by the one who wielded the blade. Cronus knew, with a knowledge that was perhaps half prophecy and half private dread, that what he had done to his father might one day be done to him. He had been warned. Some versions say Earth herself told him. Some say Sky, falling back into his far place, spoke a parting word. Either way, Cronus came into his rule already afraid of his children. That fear shaped what he did next. He married his sister Rhea, the flowing one, and from their union children began to be born. The first was Hestia, the steady one, hearth and home. The second was Demeter, the giver of grain. The third was Hera, who would one day be a queen. The fourth was Hades, who would one day be the keeper of the underworld. The fifth was Poseidon, who would one day be the lord of the sea. 5 children, 5 gathered immortals, 5 small bright lives, and Cronus, fearing each one, swallowed each one. It is a terrible image in the old telling, and tonight we will pass through it gently, the way a sleep story sets down a heavy thing in the cool grass of an evening field. The children were not destroyed. They were held alive inside their father, in a place outside ordinary time. They simply was each of them kept by Cronus's fear, suspended in the long dark of his interior, while the world above continued without yet knowing them. The old poets often described this with restraint because they understood that the image was strong enough on its own. It needed no embroidery. Rhea watched this happen again and again, and her grief grew quieter and deeper. She did not speak against her husband in those first 5 times. The old myths do not tell us why. Perhaps she did not yet know that what was happening could be stopped. Perhaps she hoped that one of the children would somehow not be taken. But by the time the 6th child was approaching, something in her had hardened into resolve. She had decided that this one would not be swallowed. So when the time came for Rhea to bring her 6th child into the world, she did not announce the labor at the high seat of the Titans. She did not go to Cronus with her belly heavy. Instead, she went secretly to Earth, her great-grandmother, the old mother who knew all hidden places, and she asked for help. Earth received her tenderly. Earth had been watching the swallowing of grandchildren and had no fondness for it. Sky, too far off, lent his quiet counsel. Together, the 2 oldest powers of the cosmos arranged a place where Rhea could be safe. The place they chose was the island of Crete. Some tellings say the cave was on Mount Ida, the high ridge where the wind moves through the pine and oak. Others say it was on Mount Dicta, the more eastern peak. The Greeks themselves never settled the question, perhaps because the question was less important than the fact. Somewhere on Crete, in a cave that smelled of stone and goat and crushed thyme, Rhea gave birth to her sixth child. That child was Zeus. He was small, the old singers say, no larger than any newborn, his small hands closing on nothing, his eyes still adjusting to the dim light of the cave. Rhea looked at him for a long moment. Then she did what mothers in old myths sometimes have to do. She gave him to others to keep, because she could not keep him herself. The others she gave him to were the nymphs of the island and the goat Amalthea, and a band of armoured youths called the Curetes. Each had a role in the protection of the hidden child. The nymphs, two in particular, named Adrasteia and Ide, became his nurses. They were the daughters of Melicius, an old Cretan king, or, in other tellings, beings older than mortal kings altogether. They held the infant Zeus. They sang to him. They rocked him in a golden cradle, which the tradition sometimes hangs from a tree, so that no part of the earth, no part of the sea, no part of the sky could be said to be the place where the child slept. The cradle hung in between, a small kindness invented to confuse the searching gaze of Cronus. Amalthea was the goat. In some traditions she was simply an unusually fine she-goat, gentle and patient, whose milk fed the hidden god. In others she was a goddess wearing the shape of a goat, an older being who had agreed to take that form for this particular task. Either way, her milk became one of the foundational images of the story. To say that Zeus was nursed by Amalthea was to say that the king of the gods had been kept alive by a creature of hooves and warm breath in a cave that no map yet knew. The Greeks loved this contradiction. It softened the great figure of Zeus before they ever showed him as a thunderer. He had been a baby. He had been fed milk. He had needed a goat. And the Curetes, those young warriors with their bronze shields, had a different task. They danced. They beat their shields. They clashed their spears in a rhythm so loud and so steady that the cries of the infant could not be heard outside the cave. When Zeus laughed, the Curetes laughed louder. When Zeus cried, the Curetes drummed their bronze. When Zeus slept, the Curetes kept their rhythm low, like the heartbeat of the mountain itself. Their dance became, in later Greek memory, the source of certain ritual movements performed in the temples of Crete long after Zeus had taken his throne. The first cradle of the Sky Father had been guarded by music. Meanwhile, on the high seat of the Titans, Cronus waited for what he believed was about to happen. He had heard that Rhea was approaching her time. He had prepared himself to receive the new child as he had received the others. And Rhea, on her return from Crete, came to him with a small bundle in her arms. The bundle was wrapped in linen. It was the right weight for an infant. It was warm, having been kept against her body. Cronus took it from her, and without inspecting it closely, he swallowed it whole. It was a stone. The old tellers smile when they say this. A simple, river-smoothed stone, swaddled in the linen meant for the sixth child, given to the father in place of the son. Cronus felt perhaps a heaviness in his belly that he could not quite name, but he was satisfied. He had done what he believed needed to be done. He returned to his rule and to his fear and to the cold and growing weight inside him that he could not measure. This is one of the small mercies of the old stories. A mother saved her child by giving a stone instead. A king of the world was tricked by linen and grief. The future of the cosmos was preserved by a hidden cradle, a goat, a circle of dancers, and a wife who had finally decided that enough was enough. The years passed slowly in the cave on Crete. Zeus grew. He grew the way mythic children grow, perhaps more quickly than ordinary children, but the old myths do not press the point. They allow him a childhood. They allow him learning. They allow him the slow filling out of strength and the steadier filling out of mind. Adrasteia and Ede cared for him. Amalthea gave him her milk until he no longer needed it. The Curetes danced. The seasons turned over the mountain, and the dawn moved across the slopes, and the sea below the cliffs rose and fell with its long Mediterranean breathing. Imagine the daily life of the hidden cave, because the old stories do not spend much time on it, and the sleep story can do that small kindness for the child. In the morning, light entered the cave only in a narrow shaft, slanting through a high opening in the limestone. The dust moved through that shaft like slow snow. Adrasteia would walk to the spring nearby and fill a clay pitcher with cold water. Ede would set out the small things of a household that did not officially exist: a wooden cup, a folded linen, a knife for cutting figs and cheese. Amalthea would graze on the slopes outside, returning in her own time when the child needed her. The Curetes would sleep in shifts, leaning against the rock walls with their bronze shields beside them, ready to drum at the first sound of any distant footstep. The child, Zeus, had no toys in the way later children of richer households would have toys. He had stones smoothed by river water. He had a wooden spoon that had been carved by one of the nymphs in an idle hour. He had a small carved bird, a swallow, given to him by Earth herself in one of her quieter visits. He had the cave itself, with all its passages and its small dripping chambers and its echoes. He explored. He grew tall enough to look out the high opening at the sky beyond. He learned the names of the stars from the nymphs, though they used older names than those we now use, names that have not been written down because the people who knew them never lived in cities. He also, in those long years, learned a kind of patience that would later be hard for the king of the gods to keep. He learned to wait without bitterness. He learned that being hidden was not the same as being forgotten. He learned that his mother loved him, even though she could not be with him most days. Rhea visited when she could, slipping away from her husband's distant attention, and her visits were short. She would hold the boy. She would look into his face. She would memorize him. Then she would go. Zeus learned that some loves are best expressed in brief, careful visits, and that those visits do not become less real for being brief. He also learned in a way no later god would quite repeat what it meant to owe his life to others. Goat, nurse, dancer, mother, grandmother, each had played a part in keeping him alive. He never forgot this in the old stories, even when later poets sometimes made him imperious. There is a thread of gratitude in the older traditions of Zeus that the loud versions of him do not always preserve. The boy in the cave had been kept by many hands, and the king on the throne remembered. Somewhere in those years, Zeus came to know what he was. The myths do not say exactly when or how. Perhaps Rhea visited him in secret and told him. Perhaps Earth came to him in the cave and explained, in her deep, slow voice, the shape of the world above and the long captivity of his brothers and sisters. Perhaps he simply understood, by the kind of inward knowledge that old myth grants its central figures, that he had been hidden for a reason, and that the reason was not yet finished with him. When he came of age, he did not march openly against his father. The old myths give Zeus at this point a slower wisdom than the simple courage of a younger son. He sought counsel. He found Metis, whose name means cunning or careful thought, the daughter of Okeanos. Metis became his first ally. She was wiser than he was. In those early days, she advised him not to confront Cronus in battle, but to free his brothers and sisters first, so that he would not stand alone. How to free them? Cronus had swallowed them. They were inside him, suspended in his long captivity. To free them, something had to come back out of Cronus. Metis prepared an herb. The old stories vary on what it was: an emetic, a draught, a small pressed root. She gave the prepared draught to Zeus, and Zeus, disguised as a cupbearer, brought it to his father. The disguise is one of the gentler details of the myth. Cronus accepted the cup. He drank. What followed has been told in many ways, and we will tell it softly. The draught did its work. From Cronus's mouth came first the stone he had swallowed in place of Zeus. Then came Hestia, the eldest, who had been the first swallowed and was the last to emerge. Then came Demeter, then Hera, then Hades, then Poseidon. 5 immortals returned to the open air, blinking at the daylight they had not seen since the moment they had been born. The stone, the old tradition says, was placed at Delphi, where it stood for centuries as a sacred relic, a small object that had once stood in for a god. Imagine the brothers and sisters of Zeus as they emerged. They were not babies anymore. Time inside Cronus had moved differently. They were full immortals, ready for what was coming. They looked at one another. They looked at the brother they had never met, the youngest, who had been kept safe while they had been kept dark. There must have been something quiet in that meeting, a recognition without words. Zeus would later be called the king of the gods, but in that first instant, he was a younger brother who had been saved by his mother and was now standing among siblings who owed him their freedom. What came next was the war that the Greeks called the Titanomachy. It is one of the great old conflicts of myth, and the singers love to describe its scale. 10 years of struggle, mountains thrown like stones, the sea turning over, the sky shaking. We will not march through the battles in detail. The sleep story does not need them. We will only mark the shape of it. The new gods stood with Zeus. The older gods, the Titans, stood with Cronus, though not all of them. Some Titans, including Themis the Upright, sided with the younger generation. The cosmos itself was divided. The decisive turn came when Zeus, again on Metis's counsel, or by Earth's quiet suggestion, went down into Tartarus, the deep pit beneath the world, and freed 2 groups of beings who had been imprisoned there by Cronus and even before him. The first were the 3 Cyclopes, the round-eyed smiths, Brontes, Sterops and Arges, whose names meant thunderer, lightning, and brightness. They were master craftsmen, and in gratitude for their freedom, they made gifts for the 3 brothers who would lead the new generation. To Zeus, they gave the thunderbolt, that bright weapon of the sky. To Poseidon, they gave the trident. To Hades, they gave the helm of darkness, which made the wearer invisible. With these 3 gifts, the brothers were equipped for what was ahead. The second group Zeus freed were the 100-handed ones, the Hecatonchires, Briareos, Kotos, and Gyges. Each of them had 100 hands and 50 heads. They were monstrous in scale, vast beyond ordinary measure, the sort of beings the old stories use when they want to convey forces so large that no single body could contain them. They had been the elder children of earth and sky, even older than the Titans, and they had been imprisoned because their power frightened even those who could not yet measure it. Zeus released them. He fed them ambrosia and nectar. He spoke to them gently. They agreed to join the war on his side. When the 100-handed ones entered the battle, the balance tipped. The old story says they hurled 300 stones at once at the Titans, a number that means everything and nothing. It means a storm of force too large to count. Cronus and his allies fell back. The lightning of Zeus fell across the upper air. The sea around the world boiled, then settled. The mountains shook, and the Titans, finally, were defeated. What was done with them is one of the older imaginings of myth. They were not killed. Immortals cannot be killed in the ordinary sense. They were cast down into Tartarus, the same deep pit from which Zeus had freed his other allies. The 100-handed ones, now released and grateful, agreed to remain as guardians. They would keep the Titans in their long imprisonment, watching with their many eyes and binding them with their many hands. The old world was sealed away beneath the new one. The age of the Titans had ended, and the age of the Olympians had begun. There were exceptions, as the old tellers always noted. Not every Titan was cast down. Themis, the upright one who had sided with the younger gods, kept her place. She would become an important counselor to Zeus, the keeper of divine law, and the mother of the Horai and the Moirai in later genealogies. Mnemosyne, the rememberer, would later lie with Zeus and bring forth the 9 muses, who would carry song and memory and the arts of human culture into the world. Helios the sun and Selene the moon, children of the Titan Hyperion, kept their cosmic posts. The Titanomachy was not a slaughter, it was a reshaping. The cosmos was rearranged, and certain elder figures simply moved sideways into the new arrangement rather than being broken by it. The Greeks were careful about this distinction. They did not imagine the old gods as evil and the new gods as righteous. The old gods had ruled an older age. The new gods would rule a different age. The change was real, but it was not a moral judgment. Cronus himself, in some later traditions, was eventually released or relocated to a quieter realm. The Romans, who inherited and reshaped the Greek myths, would even make him a kindly old figure, presiding over a golden age, the Saturn of their winter festivals. The same divine person, depending on the teller and the era, could be the swallowing father or the gentle ancient. Old myth is generous with itself. There is a sleep-friendly thought in this generosity. The world is not divided into pure heroes and pure villains. Even Cronus, the fearful father, the swallower of his own children, is allowed in some traditions to find his quiet age after the cataclysm. Even the bound Titans in certain late tellings are released from the deep pit when the world has aged enough that their old strength is no longer feared. Old myth, when it is most itself, does not insist on permanent enmities. It lets the wheel turn. It lets even the deepest darknesses find their way, eventually, into a quieter dawn. It is here that we should pause for a moment. The old stories, when they reach such a turning, often grow quieter. The singers understood that after a great battle, the listener needs a moment of stillness. So imagine, after the war, a Mediterranean evening. The sea has calmed. The smoke of the burning mountains has begun to thin. The 100-handed ones have descended again to their post in the deep, taking the bound Titans with them. Zeus stands somewhere above, perhaps on a cliff, perhaps on a high ridge of Olympus, perhaps simply in the air itself, looking out over the world that has become his to rule. He is no longer a hidden child, he is no longer a cupbearer, he is the king of a new generation of gods. But he is also tired. The old stories rarely say this out loud, but they imply it. To win a 10-year war against your own father takes something from even the immortal heart. Zeus would not be quite the same after the Titanomachy. He would carry the weight of having ended an age. He would carry the memory of what fear can drive a parent to do. He would carry, perhaps, a quiet caution about his own future children, though he would never become the swallower Cronus had been. Now, the three brothers had to decide how the world would be shared. They could each have claimed the whole, but that way leads to new wars. They could have ruled together in some council of three, but the old myths did not love arrangements quite that smooth. So they did what younger siblings have done in many old traditions. They drew lots. The names of the three great realms were placed into a helmet, perhaps the helmet of Hades himself, and each brother drew one. Zeus drew the sky, Poseidon drew the sea, Hades drew the underworld. The earth itself, with its forests and rivers and mountain ridges, was held as common ground, shared by all three. It belonged to no single brother. Mortals and beasts moved across it under the authority of the upper air, the surrounding water, and the lower world all at once. This is one of the loveliest balances in Greek myth. No one god owned the ground under your feet. The ground was shared, the way old families share certain rooms even after the property has been divided. Zeus took the sky as his realm. From that moment, weather became a kind of language he could speak. The thunderbolt was his particular voice. The eagle became his bird, the high, circling watcher. The oak became his tree, the deep-rooted, upright presence that took the lightning when it fell and stood again. The Sky Father had been born. Olympus, the mountain, became the seat of the new gods. The old singers describe its halls as bright with the work of master smiths. Some say Hephaestus, who would come later, built them. Others say the Cyclopes, the same Cyclopes who had made the thunderbolt, also raised the high palace. The roof was not exactly a roof, the floor was not exactly a floor, the walls were not exactly walls. Olympus was a place that was also a height, an idea, a vantage. From it, the gods looked down on the earth and were able to see, in their long, divine way, the doings of mortals and the slow turning of the seasons. Zeus took Hera as his queen. The old stories tell of a long courtship that was not always gentle. Hera, the proud one, had her own dignity to preserve. She did not accept her brother as her husband easily. The poets tell of a moment when Zeus in disguise came to her in a storm as a small, drenched cuckoo bird, and she sheltered the bird against her body, and the bird then revealed himself. The story is half tender, half mischievous, in the way Greek myth often is. They were married on the heights of Olympus. Their union became one of the central marriages of the old world, complicated, fierce, often unhappy, and yet enduring. The wedding of Zeus and Hera was celebrated, the old singers say, by all the gods and many of the older powers. Earth herself attended, and she brought as her wedding gift a tree of golden apples, which would later be tended by the Hesperides in the far western garden at the edge of the world. The seasons danced. The Muses sang the first of the divine wedding songs, though they would not be born for several generations yet. And so, this is one of the gentle anachronisms of Greek myth, where the singers do not mind if the chronology bends. The marriage chamber on Olympus was built with particular care. The bed itself was a thing of bronze, of cedar, of golden leaf, woven about with the careful artistry of the divine smiths. Around this bed, The long story of Olympian rule began its more domestic chapters. Hera, in her marriage, became more than the wife of Zeus. She became the keeper of marriage itself, the goddess to whom mortal brides offered sacrifice before their weddings, the goddess of the household and of childbirth, the figure presiding over the long human institution of joined lives. She had her own dignity, her own anger, her own grief at the way her husband's many affairs would shape their union. The old stories do not pretend that the marriage was happy. They tell of long quarrels, of separations and reconciliations, of arguments that shook the high halls. But they also tell that it endured. Hera did not leave. Zeus did not put her aside. The marriage, complicated as it was, held the center of the divine household. There is in this an old Greek thought worth pausing over. The marriage of the king of the gods was not a calm pastoral. It was a long negotiation between two powerful figures who had each been raised in their own way and who would never fully agree on the shape of their shared life. The poets did not soften this. They allowed Hera her anger and her cleverness. They allowed Zeus his wanderings and his eventual returns. And in the slow turning of their union, the Greeks recognized something of their own marriages, the necessary patience, the necessary forgiveness, the necessary acceptance that even immortal love is not always tidy. Between the two of them, certain children were born. Ares, the harsh god of war, whose temperament suited neither parent particularly. Hebe, the goddess of youth, who served the gods their nectar and who would later marry Heracles after his ascent to immortality. Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth, who attended every mortal labor and who, when Hera was angry, sometimes refused to come, prolonging the agony of women whose children Zeus had fathered elsewhere. The household of Zeus and Hera was both grand and difficult, both bright and shadowed. The Greeks did not try to make it tidier than it was. Behind the marriage stood Metis, the first counselor, swallowed and forever present. The old myth does not forget her. Athena, born from Zeus's head, was the visible expression of Metis's continuing presence inside her husband. The Greeks understood this. They saw that wisdom is sometimes carried inside a ruler the ruler cannot show, that the truest counsel sometimes lives in a place too deep to be displayed at court. Athena moved among the Olympian household as her father's clearest mind. She did not speak often, but when she spoke, the other gods listened. Zeus, when he wanted to know what was wise, looked toward his grey-eyed daughter and found her already considering whatever question was about to be asked. Around them gathered the household of the new gods. Demeter took her place among them as the bringer of grain. Hestia kept the hearth, the central fire of the divine household, and was honored first in every sacrifice. Poseidon went often to his sea, but kept his throne on Olympus. Hades did not climb the mountain, preferring his deep halls below, but he was counted among the high three. And then, in time, the next generation of gods began to arrive. Some were Zeus's own children, some were brought in from other lineages. The old singers tell their arrivals one by one, each with its own small drama, each with its own gift to the world. Athena was the first of these later gods, and her birth was strange even by the standards of Olympus. The old tradition says that Zeus, before he took Hera as his queen, had been with Metis, his earlier counselor, the one who had given him the herb to free his siblings. Metis became pregnant. An oracle warned Zeus that any child of Metis would be greater than the father. Zeus remembering perhaps too vividly what Cronus had done, took a different path. He did not swallow the child. He swallowed Metis herself. Inside him, she continued the work of carrying the child. The old myth does not dwell on the strangeness of this, it simply allows it. Time passed. Zeus began to suffer terrible headaches, the kind of headache that no immortal had ever felt. He went to Hephaestus, the smith god, who had by then arrived among the household. He asked Hephaestus to split his head open with an axe. Hephaestus, with the careful precision of a maker, did so. From the opened head of Zeus stepped Athena, fully grown, fully armed, grey-eyed and steady. She did not cry. She did not stumble. She simply was, at the moment of her emergence, the goddess of wisdom, craft, strategy, and the disciplined mind. The image is one of the strangest in the old corpus. It is also one of the most loved. Athena had no childhood. She did not need to be carried by anyone. She was thought made visible. And from that day onward, she stood at her father's side as his most trusted counselor, the daughter who had been carried in the mind rather than the body. The wisdom that Zeus had taken into himself and that now stood beside him. Hera, watching all this, was not pleased. She felt that if Zeus could bring a child into the world without her, she could do the same. So she conceived, by herself, a son. That son was Hephaestus himself, in some traditions. In others, Hephaestus was the son of both Zeus and Hera, and the lonely mother story belongs to a different child. The old myths are not consistent here, and the inconsistency is one of their honest charms. They allow the household of the gods to be untidy, to have rivalries, to have moments of pride and counter-pride, the way real households are. Hephaestus himself, however he came to be born, would become the divine smith, the maker of the great forges, the craftsman of the gods. His workshop, the old poets say, was beneath the volcanic islands of the Mediterranean, where the smoke and the heat of his forge rose through the earth and gave the islands their fiery breath. He made the armor of the gods, he made the chariots, he made the bronze automata, the moving figures of his own invention, which served him in his workshop, and which prefigured in the old Greek imagination the long human dream of making things that could move on their own. He made, eventually, the shield of Achilles, with its many scenes of mortal and immortal life worked into the metal in concentric bands. Hephaestus was also the lame god in some traditions. He had been thrown from Olympus, either by Hera in shame at his appearance or by Zeus in some later quarrel. The fall had injured him. He limped. The old Greeks did not turn away from this. They allowed their smith god to be marked by his fall. He became, in some sense, the patron of every craftsman who worked through difficulty, every artisan whose hands knew their craft, even when their bodies were tired or wounded. He was loved by mortal smiths in a particular and tender way, because he had known what it was to be hurt and to keep working. Around Hephaestus and Athena, the household of skilled gods began to take its shape. Athena was wisdom craft, the maker of strategy, and the patron of weavers. Hephaestus was metalcraft, the maker of weapons and instruments. Together, they presided over the long human inheritance of making things well, weaving cloth, forging bronze, building ships, raising houses, shaping clay into vessels for grain and wine. The Greeks honored both of them in workshops and small altars. A weaver would invoke Athena before beginning a new cloth. A bronze smith would invoke Hephaistos before the first heating of the forge. The work of mortal hands was, in this sense, blessed by divine hands too. There were other figures at the high household, not always central, but always present. Iris, the messenger goddess of the rainbow, who carried words between the gods and between Olympus and the earth before Hermes took over much of that work. Ganymede, the beautiful Trojan boy whom Zeus, in eagle form, carried up to Olympus to become the cupbearer of the gods, replacing Hebe in some traditions. The Charites, or Graces, 3 sisters who attended on the goddesses and who lent their soft presence to scenes of feast and celebration. The Horai, the seasons, who held the gates of Olympus and who drew aside the cloud curtain when the gods wished to look down at the earth. The cloud curtain was a beautiful detail in the old imagery. The gods did not live in plain view. Olympus was wrapped in a thick fog that mortals could not pierce. Only when the Horai drew the cloud curtain aside could anything below be seen from above, or anything above be seen from below. This meant that the gods, when they decided to walk among mortals, had to descend in disguise, because their true forms would have overwhelmed any human eye. The disguises were many: an old man with a staff, a young shepherd, a wandering merchant, a wounded bird, a bull, a swan, a shower of gold. Greek myth is full of these descents. Zeus particularly was a god of disguises. He loved to walk the world incognito, to see what was happening at ground level, to test the kindness or cruelty of those he met. These descents were not random. The old poets had a theological intuition behind them. They believed that the highest powers of the cosmos were interested not only in the grand events of war and politics, but in the small daily decisions of ordinary people. Did the woman at the well share her water with the thirsty traveller? Did the merchant give honest weight? Did the farmer leave a corner of the field for the gleaners? These small acts were watched, the old poet said, sometimes by the gods themselves in disguise. The world was a place where the divine could appear at any moment in any form, asking for a cup of water. Other children of Zeus arrived over the centuries of the divine story. Apollo and Artemis, the twin children of Leto, brought light and the hunt. Hermes, the swift son of Maia, brought roads and messages. Dionysus, the late-born son of Semele, brought wine and transformation. Persephone, daughter of Demeter, brought the long story of descent and return. Heracles, son of a mortal woman named Alcmene, would one day labour his way to immortality. The household widened and widened until Olympus held a great company. We are not telling each child's story tonight. They each have their own. We are simply noting that Zeus's role in those long centuries was to be the father of many things, some of them gods, some of them heroes, some of them harder to name. Leto's children, Apollo and Artemis, are perhaps the most luminous of Zeus's later offspring. The old story tells of how Leto, pregnant by Zeus, was driven from land to land by a furious Hera who could not bear another rival's children. No earth would receive Leto because the earth feared Hera's anger. At last, the floating island of Delos, which had no fixed place in the sea and therefore did not count as earth in the strict sense, agreed to receive her. There, by a palm tree and a quiet pool, Leto gave birth first to Artemis, the elder twin, and then, with Artemis assisting like a midwife, despite having only just been born, to Apollo. The two would become the bright sister-brother pair of the Greek pantheon, the moonlit huntress and the sun-bright musician, the goddess of forests and the god of healing and prophecy. Hermes the Swift One came to Maia in a cave on Mount Selene. He was a precocious infant. The old tradition says that on the very day of his birth he slipped out of his cradle, stole the cattle of Apollo, invented the lyre by stretching strings across a tortoise shell, and returned to his cradle before evening, where he lay innocently as if he had never moved. Apollo, when he discovered the theft, came thundering to the cave, but Hermes charmed him with music. Apollo took the lyre as compensation. Hermes received the staff of the herald and the role of messenger between worlds. From that day, Hermes was the god of roads, of crossings, of clever bargains, and of the slow guiding of souls from the upper world to the lower at the end of mortal life. Dionysus's birth was stranger still. His mother Semele was a mortal princess of Thebes, beloved by Zeus. Hera, in her usual jealousy, came to Semele in disguise and persuaded her to ask Zeus to appear in his full divine form as he did to other gods. Semele asked. Zeus, who had sworn an oath to grant her wish, could not refuse. He appeared. The mortal body of Semele could not endure the sight, and she was burned away in the bright presence. But Zeus saved the unborn child by sewing him into his own thigh, where Dionysus grew to term, and was eventually born from the divine flesh of his father. The Greeks loved this story for its strangeness. It made Dionysus the twice-born god, the god of transformations, the god who came from a place no other deity had come from. Persephone, the daughter of Demeter, was not strictly speaking Zeus's child in every tradition, but the most common version makes her so. She would later be taken into the underworld by Hades, in the long story that gave the seasons their shape. Persephone's tale belongs to another night. We mention her only to mark that Zeus was, in some way, the father of the seasons themselves, in that his daughter became the bridge between the upper world and the lower, and her movement between them set the year in motion. Heracles, the great hero, was the son of Zeus by Alcmene, a mortal woman of Thebes. His story is the longest of all the children's stories, with its 12 labors and its many adventures and its final ascent to Olympus. Heracles, more than any of the other children, embodied the way Zeus could enter the mortal world and produce, from that entering, a figure who would one day join the immortals. His tale, too, belongs to another night. There were many more: Castor and Polydeuces, the heavenly twins; Helen, who would become the cause of a great war; Minos, who would judge the dead; Perseus, who would behead Medusa. Dionysian initiates would later count nearly every Greek city as having some descent from Zeus, and the kings of those cities would often trace their lineage back to one of his many sons. The household of the Sky Father was vast. It branched into every corner of the old Greek imagination. It is part of why he is called the father in the largest sense, not only the father of certain children, but the father of the long human inheritance of myth itself. At the center of his rule was a question the Greeks asked themselves often: what is the king of the gods for? They did not always answer it in the same way. Some said Zeus was for thunder, for weather, for the high air. Some said he was for kings, lending divine authority to the mortal rulers who claimed his descent. Some said he was for oaths, the great keeper of the bond between word and deed. Some said he was for hospitality, the protector of the stranger at the door. Each of these answers was partly true. Together, they outlined a figure who was both terrible and patient, both wide as the sky and as particular as a single broken promise. Good evening and welcome back, if your mind has wandered for a little while into the soft middle of the story. The names have grown thicker and the events have multiplied, but you do not need to hold them. You may keep one image and let the rest drift. You may keep the swaddled stone or the cave on Crete, or the grey-eyed daughter, or the lots drawn from the helmet. Any one of these is enough to carry the shape of the myth. Let us take, for a little while, the older Greek thought about Zeus as the keeper of oaths. To swear by Zeus was, in the ancient world, to invite his witnessing. The witness was not casual. If you swore by Zeus and broke the oath, you placed yourself in a position the old world found dangerous. The gods who watched did not always punish immediately, the old singers admitted. Sometimes the punishment arrived in a later generation in some unforeseen way, in a household that had forgotten the oath. The old Greeks believed that an oath sworn aloud entered the air, and the air belonged to Zeus, and the air had a long memory. This is one of the gentler powers of Zeus, less dramatic than the thunderbolt, but perhaps more lasting. He was the upper air that received what people said. A promise spoken under his sky was not a private matter. It joined a long conversation between human voices and the listening heights. To break such a promise was to break something larger than a personal trust. It was to teach the sky that words could not be relied upon, and the old Greeks felt that such a lesson, if repeated too often, could thin the very weather of the world. Closely related to oath-keeping was the old practice of hospitality, called xenia. To welcome a stranger to your door, to give them water and bread and a place to rest before asking who they were, was to honor Zeus in his role as protector of suppliants. The old stories often turned on this. A wanderer would arrive at a house and the household would or would not receive them well, and only later would it become clear that the wanderer was Zeus himself, walking the earth in disguise to see how mortals treated those who came in need. The most beloved of these stories is the tale of Baucis and Philemon. They were an old couple living in a small house on a hillside in Phrygia. Their household was poor. Their roof was thatched with reeds, their walls held only a few pieces of bread, a small jar of wine, and a single goose. One evening, 2 travelers came to their door. The travelers had already been turned away from many richer houses in the valley below. Baucis and Philemon, however, opened their door. They sat the strangers down, they washed their feet, they set the small store of bread and wine on the table. What followed was one of the quietest miracles in Greek myth. The jar of wine did not empty. As Baucis poured, more wine appeared. As Philemon cut bread, more bread was there to cut. The old couple slowly understood that the strangers were no ordinary travelers. They moved to slaughter their goose to offer a proper feast, but the goose fled, hid behind the strangers, and the strangers said softly that no sacrifice was needed. The strangers were Zeus and Hermes. They had been testing the valley. The valley had failed. Only this small thatched house had welcomed them. The old myth tells what came next with a certain grandeur. The valley below was swallowed by a flood in punishment for its inhospitality. The little house, however, became a temple, golden-roofed where it had once been thatched, marble-walled where it had once been clay. Baucis and Philemon, when at last their long lives drew toward an end, asked only one gift of the gods. that neither should outlive the other. The gods granted it. The old couple in their last hour became two trees standing side by side, an oak and a linden growing together near the door of the temple they had once been. Travelers in later centuries, the story says, would still leave small offerings on the lower branches. It is a small story among the many stories of Zeus, but it is one of the ones that reveals him most clearly. The thunderbolt was not always raised. Sometimes the king of the gods walked in disguise, hungry from the road, ready to be turned away. To be a household that fed him was to enter the long Greek tradition of hospitality. To be a household that turned him away was to risk, in the old imagination, a flood you could not predict. There are other small Zeus stories like this: the shepherd who shared his cheese, the merchant who refused, the widow who gave water from a broken cup. The old singers loved these stories because they brought the great Sky Father down to the table. Zeus was not only a high thunderer, he was also, in another aspect, a stranger you might not recognize until after you had decided how to treat him. Consider how strange and how kind this thought was for the people who carried it. The Greeks lived in a world without prisons in the modern sense, without police, without the social safety nets that later ages would build. A traveler on a road between cities was vulnerable. Night could find them far from any inn, weather could turn against them, robbers could find them in lonely passes. Their only real protection was the old tradition of hospitality, which said that anyone who arrived at your door should be received, fed, and given a place to sleep before being asked their name or their business. This tradition had no enforcement except the watching of the gods, and chief among those watchers was Zeus. In some sense, then, every stranger at your door was Zeus, not because the gods were always literally walking in disguise, though sometimes in the old stories they were, but because the kindness you showed to the stranger was being witnessed by the Sky Father, whose memory was long. The old Greeks lived under this kind of moral weather. It was not a system of laws, it was a system of stories told and retold until the listeners knew in their bones that the wanderer at the gate might be a god, and that the gate had better open. We could pause here for a moment on the small theology of this. The Greeks did not have one consistent doctrine about how the gods worked. Different cities held different views, different poets emphasized different aspects. But there was a wide agreement that the relationship between mortal and immortal was not one of obedience to commands. It was more like the relationship between a household and a long-staying guest of high rank, a relationship of mutual courtesy, careful attention, and the understanding that the guest could leave at any time, and that if the guest left, the house would feel the absence. This is one reason the Greek imagination of Zeus is gentler than the louder later versions of him. He was not, in the deepest old strata, a tyrant. He was a presence whom one had to know how to host. The thunderbolt was his power, but the thunderbolt was rarely his first response. His first response was to walk among mortals quietly, watch, and remember. In addition to the great moments of hospitality, there were also the long Greek practices of swearing by Zeus. A merchant agreeing to a trade would swear by Zeus and shake hands. A general making a treaty with another city would swear by Zeus and pour out a libation. A man taking a wife would swear by Zeus and Hera together, calling both upon the union. The witnessing was both serious and ordinary. The gods were not asked to attend only at high state occasions. They were called in at every contract, every promise, every small turning of the wheel of human commerce. This made Zeus, in his ordinary daily aspect, the god of trust. Trust between strangers, trust between trading partners, trust between political allies, trust between husbands and wives. Without him, the old Greeks felt, the slow, patient weaving of human society would unravel. He was not so much the punisher of broken oaths as the keeper of the air in which oaths were made. To break an oath was not exactly to anger him in a personal way. It was to teach the air that words could not be trusted, and the air, breathing through all the lives that depended on shared promises, would eventually grow thin. Eventually, the world would fail. This is a quieter and more constitutional view of Zeus than the storm king of louder traditions. It is the Zeus of philosophers, of jurists, of the old men who watched young men make rash promises and shook their heads gently. It is the Zeus of the morning, of the careful sharing of bread, of the agreement to meet again tomorrow, and to mean it. To these tales of hospitality, we should add the old practice of seeking Zeus's voice at his sacred oracles. The most famous of these was at Dodona, in the cool oak forests of Epirus in northwestern Greece. Dodona was older than Delphi. It was perhaps the oldest oracle in the Greek world. Its priests, called the Seloi, were said to sleep on the ground and to keep their feet unwashed so that they would remain in close contact with the earth and the roots of the sacred grove. Their work was to listen. What they listened to was the rustling of the leaves of a great oak tree, the tree of Zeus. The wind moved the leaves spoke, and the Seloi, in their long-trained listening, interpreted what the leaves said. Sometimes the message was given through other signs, the cooing of doves in the branches, the flowing of a small spring beneath the tree, the ringing of bronze vessels hung on the lower limbs. Zeus's voice at Dodona was not a thunderclap. It was an old wind in old leaves, attended by people who had given their lives to the patient art of listening. There is something restful in the image of Dodona, a grove, an old tree, people who sleep on the ground and keep their feet bare, bronze vessels hanging in the lower branches, ringing softly when the breeze rises. A king of the gods who speaks in this slow, rustling way, never in haste, never in shouts. The Greeks knew that the thunderbolt was not the only voice their great god possessed. He could also be a whisper. He could also be the leaf turning over to show its pale underside. He could also be the silence between two breaths of wind. The Seloi, the priests of Dodona, were said to be descended from a line older than the Greek-speaking peoples of the region. Some traditions made them Pelasgians, the elder population of Greece before the arrival of the Hellenes. Some traditions made them simply servants of the oak. They wore plain robes. They did not boast of their lineage. They lived simply near the grove, eating what the land provided. Pilgrims would come from far away to consult the oracle. The pilgrims would ask their questions, often written on small lead tablets that have been found by archaeologists in modern times. The questions were practical. Should I marry this woman? Should I begin this voyage? Has my wife been faithful? Will the crops fail? The Seloi would listen to the tree. They would interpret. They would answer. What is moving about Dodona is that the questions were not always grand. They were the questions of ordinary lives. A shepherd asking about a lost flock. A young man asking whether his beloved would have him. A widow asking whether to remarry. The king of the gods received all these questions through the rustling of his oak, and his priests answered them all with the same patience. Zeus was not too high for the small grief of a shepherd. The thunderbolt was for the great moments, the leaf speech was for the rest of life. Other oracles of Zeus existed too. There was Siwa, in the deep oasis of the Libyan desert, where Zeus was worshipped as Zeus Ammon, with the curled horns of the Egyptian god mixed into the Greek imagination. Alexander the Great would later travel to Siwa and be told by the priests there that he was the son of Zeus. There was Olympia, which became famous for its games but was also a sanctuary, with an enormous gold and ivory statue of Zeus by the sculptor Phidias, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. There were smaller shrines on hilltops across the Greek-speaking world, simple altars where a farmer could lay an offering of grain or wine and ask, briefly, for fair weather. The Sky Father was approachable in many forms, but that is a story for another day. The grove had many tellings, and each tradition added its own small detail, and tonight we will not chase them all. We will only carry from Dodona the image of listening. The old Greeks believed that the divine was not only loud, it was also patient. It also rewarded those who came quietly. Now the night is older. The story has carried us through many chambers. Let us, for a little while, gather the figures and look at them again, not to seize them, but to let them settle. Rhea, who saved her son with a stone, Cronus, who feared and swallowed and was finally undone by an herb in a cup, the cave on Crete, where a goat fed a god and a circle of dancers drowned out his crying, the Cyclopes, with their bright forge and their gift of the thunderbolt, the 100-handed ones who descended again into the deep, taking the bound titans with them, Hera, the proud queen whose marriage to Zeus was older than any city, Athena, the grey-eyed daughter born from the head of her father, Apollo, Artemis, Hermes, Dionysus, Persephone, and many others, each with their own night to be told. Baucis and Philemon, who became 2 trees beside a small golden temple. The Seloi at Dodona, sleeping on the bare ground, listening to leaves. For now, remember this. Zeus is not the loudest figure in his own myth. The loudest figures are the storms, the wars, the catastrophes. Zeus himself in the long Greek imagination is something quieter. He is the upper air. He is the watcher of oaths. He is the host disguised as a stranger. He is the leaf in the oak that turns just before the rain. He is the steady weight of a sky that does not have to remind you every minute that it is there. The thunderbolt is only one of his voices and not perhaps the truest. The Greeks who lived under Zeus's sky knew this, even if they did not always say it. They built temples to him on hilltops, because hilltops were closer to his realm. They sacrificed under the open air rather than indoors, because the open air was where he lived. They named their children, sometimes for him, Diodotus, given by Zeus. They opened their hands at the start of a meal to acknowledge the unseen guest who might be at the table. They watched the weather not only for practical reasons but for theological ones. The clouds that gathered, the wind that turned, the rain that softened the dust, the dry season that pressed upon the fields, all of these were Zeus speaking. To live under his sky was to live as part of a slow, ongoing conversation. There is a philosophy here that the old Greeks did not always put into formal words, but that lay quietly under their daily life. The world has a high canopy. Under that canopy all human beings stand. Some of them are kings, some are slaves, Some are wanderers without names, some are wealthy, some are starving, some are wise, some are foolish. But the sky is shared, the weather is shared, the thunder, when it comes, is heard by all. There is a kind of democracy in this, ancient and unequal in its actual workings, but real as an idea. Under Zeus's sky, no mortal stands above the weather. The later Greek philosophers, the ones who would eventually shift from myth to abstract thought, took up this image and turned it gently. The Stoics, in particular, made much of Zeus. For them, he was less the bearded king of Olympus, and more the rational principle that pervaded the cosmos, the logos, the deep order by which things were what they were. To live in accordance with Zeus in this later philosophical view was to live in accordance with the deep order of reality itself. To resist that order was to set yourself against the very weather of being. The Stoics did not abandon the older imagery. They simply understood it as a kind of poetry, pointing at a deeper truth. For other Greek thinkers, Zeus was the model of just kingship. Plato, in some of his dialogues, used the figure of Zeus to discuss what a wise ruler should be. Not the tyrant who takes pleasure in his power, but the careful father, who tempers his strength with mercy, who listens before he acts, who maintains the long order of his household even when individual moments tempt him toward shortcuts. The image was idealized, and the actual political life of Greek cities did not always match it, but the image was there, in the cultural air, as something kings could be compared to and found wanting. For the ordinary Greek who was not a philosopher, Zeus was simpler. He was the sky you woke up under. He was the rain that fell on your fields. He was the storm that frightened you when you were a child. He was the slow brightening of dawn that meant another day of work was beginning. He was the first cup of wine poured out in his honor at any feast. He was the witness to the small daily oaths that held a household together. I will be home before dark. I will not raise my voice in anger today. I will bring back what I have promised. These small oaths, sworn under the canopy of the sky, were Zeus's smallest acts of governance. There is in the figure of Zeus, taken as a whole, a quality the old Greeks valued highly, but did not always name. It is something like dignified attention. The sky is always there. It does not press itself upon you. It does not demand your constant gaze. But when you look up, it is present, and it is vast, and it has been there long before you. There is no need to perform for it. There is no need to convince it of your existence. The sky already knows. The sky is the long, patient witness of every small life that has ever passed beneath it. To carry this thought toward sleep is to feel that the night sky outside, even if you cannot see it from where you rest, is the same canopy under which every Greek who ever told this story slept and woke. The same Zeus they imagined as listening is, in a sense, still listening. Not perhaps as a literal god, but as the long inherited image of a high, open, watching presence that holds us all without insisting on being noticed. The room you are in tonight, the bed you are in, the body that has carried you through the day, all of these are under the same wide weather that the Greeks lived under. The myth has not stopped being true in its softer ways, even if its louder claims belong now to a different age. This, perhaps, is the gentlest gift of the Zeus myth for a sleep story. The Sky Father is not a tyrant who needs to be obeyed in every small thing. He is, in his most lasting form, the simple fact of a shared canopy. You do not need to win his favor to sleep under it. You only need to lie down. The night sky, whether you see it through a window or only feel it overhead, is the long old realm of the god the Greeks called, by many names, Zeus, Zen, the bright sky, the gatherer of clouds, the High Father, the cloud-gathering one. If you are still listening, the canopy is over you now. The weather, whatever it is, belongs to the same long inheritance. The wind through the leaves of any tree, anywhere in the world tonight, is a kind of leaf speech that the old Seloi at Dodona would have known how to read. The slow turning of the season towards sleep is a kind of weather of its own. Now, let the story loosen, the way every long telling must when sleep approaches. Let the cave on Crete fade into a low, dark line of mountain. Let the cradle hanging from its tree settle into the slow rhythm of any breath. Let the goat Amalthea walk back into the deep grass of her own quiet existence. Let the Curetes lower their bronze. Let the silent army of stars take up their slow watch above the sleeping world. Let Olympus become a high, pale shape in the distance, neither close enough to demand attention nor far enough to be forgotten. Let Hera, in her throne room, lean her head against her hand, and let her thoughts also grow soft. Let Athena rest her spear against the wall. Let the eagle close its great eye. Good evening and welcome back, one last time, to the slow, gentle work of letting the story rest. The night has carried Zeus a long way, from a hidden cave to a high throne, to a quiet leaf in a sacred oak. There are many other tellings of him, many other quarrels, many other stories of his children and his judgments, and we have not told them tonight. But that is a story for another day. The cosmos has many doors into the same chamber, and tonight we have taken only one. For now, remember this. Tonight, the work of the tale is done. It simply was, like all old stories, the carrying of a great sky figure through the long inheritance of nights. Each teller passes the story along a little softer, a little wiser, a little less afraid of its thunder. Let the names settle now. Let the room settle. Let the night gather you up. Imagine the high seat of Olympus far behind you, the long council of the new gods, and the long war with the old gods no longer pressing on your thoughts. In your mind, reach back and close an invisible door to the bright halls, feeling it move on silent hinges, sealing the thunderbolt, the eagle, the sacred oak, and the long history of the Sky Father in calm and order. Then see a single candle, its flame steady in the darkness. With a slow, gentle breath, blow that candle out and let the last curl of light fade into the night. Rest well, sleep deeply, and let the ancient stories carry you into the night.